Frank Lewis never asked for attention. At 68, the black bus driver simply did his job, ferrying passengers along Route 19 with quiet dignity. Until the day he stood up for a harassed mother and her child, only to find himself face down, on the pavement, handcuffed by Officer Blake Murdoch while bystanders recorded in shock. The police thought it would end there, just another elderly man taught to stay in his place. They were catastrophically wrong. The deleted footage found its way to a Montana wilderness where Caleb Lewis, Frank's son, decorated Green Beret, ghost among shadows, watched his father's blood stain the concrete. Captain Holloway's militarized precinct couldn't know they'd just awakened a man who had turned killing into an art form. As Frank sat alone on his porch that evening, miles away, Caleb methodically prepared for homecoming. Some men you can humiliate without consequence. Frank Lewis was not one of them. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The soft glow of a bedside lamp illuminated Frank Lewis's weathered face as he rose before the sun. At 68, his body protested with familiar aches, but his internal clock remained as reliable as ever. 4:30 in the morning, same as when he'd served in Vietnam, same as his 30 years driving city buses. Frank moved slowly through his modest home, a small two-bedroom house in the eastern part of the city. Pictures of his late wife, Evelyn, smiled at him from the walls, frozen in time while he kept aging. He touched one frame gently, his morning ritual, before heading to the kitchen. "Morning, Evelyn," he whispered. "Another day." After a simple breakfast of instant oatmeal and black coffee, Frank buttoned his Metro Transit uniform shirt with careful precision. The collar was frayed slightly, the embroidered name patch faded from countless washings, but Frank kept it immaculate. Respect for the uniform, something he'd learned in the Army and never forgotten. As Frank stepped onto his front porch with his thermos, he spotted Rico Martinez working under the hood of an old Chevy in the neighboring driveway. The 19-year-old mechanic prodigy waved enthusiastically. "Morning, Mr. Lewis. Early as always." Frank smiled, his stern face softening. "Morning, Rico. That junker giving you trouble again?" "Nothing I can't handle." Rico wiped his hands on a rag. "Just needs some love and attention, like your bus, right?" "Route 19 is a lady who knows what she wants," Frank chuckled. "You staying out of trouble?" Rico's smile dimmed slightly. "Trying to, sir. Applied for that apprenticeship at Wilson's auto shop yesterday." "You'll get it," Frank said with certainty. "Best damn mechanic I've ever seen, and I've seen plenty." "Thanks, Mr. Lewis. That means a lot coming from you." Frank nodded, pleased to see the boy's smile return. He'd taken a quiet interest in Rico since the boy's father had been deported 3 years ago. Never mentioned it, never made a fuss. Just kept an eye out, the way neighbors should. "Gotta roll," Frank said, checking his watch. "Bus won't drive itself." "Yet," Rico laughed. "They keep talking about those self-driving buses." "Not in my lifetime," Frank replied. "Some things need a human touch." The walk to the transit depot took 12 minutes exactly. Frank greeted the night shift dispatchers, checked his route clipboard, and performed his pre-trip inspection on bus 2187 with methodical care. Every mirror adjusted perfectly, every emergency exit checked, every inch of his route mapped in his mind. By 6:15, Frank was pulling out of the depot, headed for his first stop on Route 19. The city was just beginning to stir, streetlights still glowing against the pre-dawn purple sky. Frank felt the familiar calm settle over him behind the wheel. Here, he knew exactly what to do and how to do it. The first passengers of the day were the usual crowd. Night shift hospital workers heading home, early morning construction crews, kitchen staff for downtown restaurants. Frank knew most by name, greeting them with a quiet nod or a morning as they boarded. "Good morning, Mr. Lewis," said Martha, a night nurse from Memorial Hospital. "Cold one today." "Morning, Martha. They treating you right over there?" "Same as always," she sighed, dropping her fare in the box. "Too many patients, not enough hands." Frank nodded sympathetically. "Your grandson still playing ball?" The woman's tired face brightened. Championship game this weekend. He's pitching. He'll do great, got his grandmother's determination. The small exchange took seconds, but Frank saw Martha's shoulders relax as she made her way to a seat. These small moments, the human connections that made the city feel less cold, they mattered. As the morning progressed and the bus filled with the daily commuters, Frank navigated through the changing neighborhoods of his route. Route 19 ran from the eastern working-class districts through areas of rapid gentrification and into the financial district downtown. Frank watched the transformation of his city every day through the windows of his bus. Old family businesses replaced by artisanal coffee shops, rent signs multiplying, and longtime residents disappearing. By 9:30, the bus carried a mix of people that represented the city's divisions. Tired mothers with small children, teenagers with headphones, business people staring at phones, and elderly passengers clutching shopping bags. Frank kept the peace with quiet authority, a moving community under his watch. At the Westfield Avenue stop, a young man boarded who immediately set Frank on edge. Tall and wiry with angry eyes, he swayed slightly as he dropped his fare in the face. The smell of alcohol wasn't strong, but it was there. Frank nodded politely. "Morning, sir. Please find a seat." The man, later identified as Trent Wilson, scowled but moved down the aisle. Frank watched him in the mirror, noting how other passengers subtly shifted away. A young Latina woman sat near the middle of the bus, holding a sleeping toddler on her lap. Trent chose the seat directly behind her. For several blocks, everything remained calm. Then Frank heard it, the low mutter of insults just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Taking all the jobs. Go back to where you came from." Frank glanced in his mirror again. The young mother stared straight ahead, her arms tightening around her child. Her face remained composed, but Frank saw the fear in her eyes. Other passengers looked uncomfortably at their phones or out the windows, pretending not to hear. The muttering grew louder. "Hey, I'm talking to you, lady. Don't you understand English?" Frank pulled the bus smoothly to the next stop. No passengers. We're waiting to board. He secured the brake and stood up, turning to face the interior. "Sir," he said calmly, addressing Trent, "I need you to keep your voice down. We've got a sleeping child here." Trent's eyes narrowed. "Mind your own business, old man. I paid my fare." "You did," Frank agreed. "And the fare buys you transportation, not the right to disturb other passengers. Now please keep it down or you'll need to exit at the next stop." "You threatening me?" Trent stood up, towering over the seated mother and child. The toddler stirred and began to whimper. Frank's voice remained calm, but his eyes hardened. "No threats, just policy. This is a public bus and everyone has the right to ride in peace." What Frank didn't see was a passenger in the back of the bus discreetly making a phone call, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "There's a situation on the number 19 bus. Yeah, a black man is threatening people. He's being aggressive. Near the corner of Westfield and Monroe." Frank stepped closer to Trent, still maintaining a respectful distance. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step off the bus at this stop." "Like hell I will." Trent's voice rose and the toddler began crying in earnest. "You can't make me do anything, old man." Frank stood his ground. "Sir, I don't want any trouble. Please step off the bus now." Another passenger, an older gentleman in a business suit, stood up. "Listen to the driver, buddy. Just go cool off somewhere else." For a moment, Trent seemed to waver. Then, with a final glare at the mother and Frank, he stormed toward the door. "This is bullshit. I'm filing a complaint." "That's your right," Frank said evenly, returning to his seat as Trent exited. He glanced back at the young mother. "You okay, miss?" She nodded, soothing her crying child. "Thank you," she said softly. Frank restarted the route, unaware that the situation was far from over. 2 stops later, as passengers exited and entered in the routine dance of public transit, Frank noticed a police cruiser pull alongside the bus with lights flashing. His heart sank slightly. Paperwork, delays, not what his passengers needed. Frank opened the doors, expecting an officer to step aboard with questions about the earlier incident. Instead, Officer Blake Murdoch charged up the steps with his hand on his holstered weapon, face tight with adrenaline. "Driver, step off the vehicle now," Murdoch shouted, his stance aggressive. Frank blinked in confusion. "Officer, is there a problem? I had a disruptive passenger earlier, but he's gone now. Hands where I can see them. Exit the vehicle immediately." Murdoch's hand moved to fully grip his weapon. Behind him, Officer Dana Rivas appeared at the door, her expression more measured but equally tense. "Sir, please comply," she said firmly. Bewildered but not wanting to escalate the situation, Frank raised his hand slowly. "I'm complying, officers. Just let me secure the bus first." "Now!" Murdoch barked. Frank carefully set the brake and switched off the engine. The passengers watched in stunned silence as he stood and moved toward the door. The moment Frank stepped onto the sidewalk, Murdoch grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around, slamming him face first against the side of the bus. "Officer, what is this about?" Frank asked, his voice strained as Murdoch wrenched his arms behind his back. "We received reports of a hostile black male threatening passengers," Murdoch growled, cinching handcuffs tightly around Frank's wrists. "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting," Frank said calmly, though panic began to rise in his chest. "There's been a mistake. I'm the driver. The hostile passenger left the bus 10 minutes ago." Officer Rivas glanced uncertainly at the passengers, now pressing against the windows, some shouting protests. "Blake, I think—" "Shut up and secure the scene," Murdoch snapped, forcing Frank to the ground. The asphalt scraped Frank's cheek as Murdoch's knee pressed into his back. The young mother with the toddler rushed off the bus. "Officers, stop! He's the driver. He protected us from a drunk man who was harassing us." Murdoch ignored her. "Stay back, ma'am. This is police business." Frank lay on the pavement, the weight of Murdoch's knee making it difficult to breathe. His lips were bleeding from the impact with the ground, and pain radiated through his ribs. A teenage boy from across the street had his phone out, live-streaming the incident. Other bystanders gathered, many recording, voices rising in protest. "He didn't do anything." "That's the bus driver, you idiots." "He's an old man. What are you doing?" Officer Rivas approached her partner. "Blake, the witnesses are saying he's the driver. I think we need to—" "I've got this under control," Murdoch hissed, jerking Frank to his feet. "We're taking him in for questioning." Frank, dazed and hurting, caught the eye of the teenager filming. "Tell Rico what happened," he managed to say, before being shoved into the back of the police cruiser. Hours later, after being processed, questioned, and finally released without charges, Frank Lewis limped home. No apology, no explanation, just a dismissive "you're free to go" from the desk sergeant. As darkness fell, Frank sat alone on his porch, touching his swollen lip gingerly. He hadn't called anyone, hadn't reported to the transit authority, just called in sick for tomorrow and sat in silence, watching darkness settle over his neighborhood. Across the country, in a remote cabin nestled in the Montana wilderness, a man sat in a dimly lit room. Military precision defined the space. Maps on the walls, surveillance equipment humming softly, weapons stored with meticulous care. The man's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he cleaned a high-powered rifle. On a laptop screen before him played a video, the teenager's live stream, recovered from a dark web mirror site after being mysteriously removed from social media platforms within hours of posting. The man paused the video on a frame showing Frank Lewis's bloodied face, pressed against the pavement. His expression didn't change, but his hand stilled on the rifle. Caleb Lewis, Frank's estranged son, former Green Beret sniper with the highest confirmed kill count in his unit's history, set down the cleaning cloth and reached for his phone. It was time to go home. The cabin's interior told Caleb Lewis's story more truthfully than any military record ever could. Tactical maps covered one wall, not just of foreign territories, but of American cities as well. Glass cases held medals he never wore, but couldn't bring himself to discard. A worn journal sat open on the desk, filled with entries written in a precise, controlled hand. Dates, distances, weather conditions, kills. Caleb stood at the window, staring across the vast Montana wilderness that had been his refuge for 3 years. In his hand, He held a printed screenshot of his father's bloodied face. The rage he felt wasn't hot or explosive. It was cold, focused, the kind that made him the most dangerous sniper in Green Beret history. The ham radio in the corner crackled to life. Whiskey Echo 7 to long shot. Confirm receipt of visual. Data packet. Caleb crossed to the radio. Received. Assessment? Local PD suppressed footage through back channels. Officer identified as Blake Murdoch. 5 excessive force complaints in 3 years. All dismissed. Department under Captain Jerry Holloway. Private security connections. Proceed with caution. Understood. Long shot going dark. Caleb switched off the radio and picked up his phone. The number he dialed hadn't been used in nearly 4 years. After 3 rings, a woman's voice answered, cool and professional. Melanie Parker. It's me, Caleb said simply. The silence stretched for several seconds. I thought we said all we needed to say. They touched my father. The tone shifted immediately. What happened? As Caleb explained, he moved through the cabin, already packing essential equipment. Weapons, surveillance gear, identity documents. The tools of a ghost who never truly left the war behind. The city's changed, Caleb, Melanie said when he finished. Holloway's taken over half the district with his private security contracts. They're militarizing the police faster than anyone can track. Good. Then they'll understand what real military tactics look like. Caleb, I'm not asking for permission, Mel, just letting you know I'm coming. After a pause, she sighed. Your father needs more than a vengeful son with a sniper rifle. I know. That's why I called you first. 3 days later, Frank Lewis sat in a sterile waiting area at the police precinct. His bruises had deepened to a mottled purple, his lips still swollen despite the ice he'd applied. The young desk officer barely glanced at him. I'd like to file a complaint about my treatment during an arrest 3 days ago, Frank said quietly. The officer didn't look up from his computer. Fill out this form. Frank took the paperwork and spent 30 minutes meticulously documenting the incident. When he returned it to the desk, the officer scanned it with visible disinterest. We'll review this and contact you if necessary, he said, tossing the form into a tray. When might I expect to hear something? Frank asked. The officer finally looked at him, eyes cold. Look, old-timer, you want some advice? You want to make this worse for yourself? Because that's what happens to people who push this kind of thing. Frank held the man's gaze, decades of dignity in his posture despite the pain in his ribs. I just want it on record. It's on record. Now move along. There are people with real problems waiting. Frank walked slowly out of the precinct, the weight of humiliation heavier than his physical injuries. As he waited at the bus stop, now a passenger instead of a driver, he didn't notice the black SUV parked across the street, or the man inside watching him through polarized windows. Across town, Officer Dana Riva sat in her car in the precinct parking lot, long after her shift had ended. On the passenger seat lay a voice recorder and a manila folder containing photocopied internal reports. Her hand hovered over them, indecision written across her face. The incident with Frank Lewis wasn't the first time Blake Murdoch had escalated a situation unnecessarily. It wasn't even the 10th time. But it was the first time Dana had secretly recorded the aftermath. Murdoch bragging in the break room about teaching the old man a lesson. Captain Holloway's dismissive laughter, the casual agreement to adjust. The report. Her phone buzzed with a text from Murdoch. Drinks tonight? Team building. Captain's orders. Dana stared at the message, then at the folder beside her. Was she protecting herself by collecting evidence, or was she finally finding the courage to protect others? She wasn't sure yet. At that moment, in a upscale downtown cafe, Melanie Parker sat across from Nina Holloway, the 22-year-old daughter of Captain Jerry Holloway, and an outspoken community activist studying criminal justice at the local community college. Your father's new security contracts are raising serious concerns, Melanie said, her recorder discreetly placed between them. Private entities performing public policing functions with minimal oversight. Nina pushed her dark hair behind her ears, a nervous gesture that contrasted with her confident voice. That's why I agreed to talk to you. Dad thinks I don't know what's happening, but the community forums are filled with stories. Increased stops in certain neighborhoods, confiscated phones, deleted videos. Like what happened to Frank Lewis. Nina's eyes widened. You know about that? I just heard his name at a town hall meeting yesterday. An elderly bus driver assaulted during an arrest. She leaned forward. Was that Murdoch's work? Dad's golden. Boy. Melanie nodded. The footage vanished within hours. Not all of it, Nina said quietly. My friend works IT at the precinct. He says there's a shadow server where it all goes. As they continued their conversation, neither noticed the man at a corner table, baseball cap pulled low, listening to every word. That evening, Frank Lewis sat on his porch steps in the gathering darkness, sipping tea that did little to ease the ache in his bones. The neighborhood was quiet, most families already inside for dinner. His mind wandered to his son, not as the hardened warrior he'd become, but as the sensitive boy who'd drawn detailed pictures of birds and collected interesting rocks. The boy who'd enlisted after 9/11 with idealistic fervor, returning from multiple deployments increasingly remote, until the day he'd exploded at Frank for not understanding what it's like out there, and disappeared from his life. Frank was so lost in memory that he almost missed the small white envelope that had appeared on his welcome mat. No stamp, no address, just his name in a familiar, precise handwriting. With trembling fingers, Frank opened it and read the simple message inside. You don't have to stand alone anymore. See. For the first time since the incident on the bus, Frank Lewis broke down and wept. Miles away, in a nondescript motel room, Caleb Lewis methodically assembled surveillance equipment, 3 separate phones with scrambled signals, laptop with secure VPN, topographical maps of the city with key locations marked, the precinct, his father's home, Officer Murdoch's address, Captain Holloway's office and residence. On the bed lay a tactical vest, non-military clothing in neutral colors, and a case containing specialized equipment that few outside elite special forces had ever seen. Caleb moved with the focus of a man who had never truly left the battlefield, because, for him, the war had simply changed locations. Now it had come to his father's doorstep, and Caleb Lewis was about to bring the fight back to those who had started it. His phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. She's interested. Meeting tomorrow. Watch your back. Ghost is in play. Caleb's expression hardened. If Ghost was involved, the situation was even more complex than he'd anticipated. Ghost. The code name for the handler who'd run Caleb's most classified operations, the man who'd enabled the darkest missions and then disappeared when scrutiny came. Outside Officer Dana Rivas's apartment, Caleb sat watching as she paced inside, phone to her ear, gesturing emphatically. He couldn't hear her words, but her body language told him she was conflicted, afraid, a potential ally, if he could reach her before fear pushed her back in line. Tomorrow, he would make his first move. Dawn hadn't yet broken when Officer Dana Rivas left her apartment building. She walked to her car with keys clutched between her fingers, a habit from police academy training. The parking lot was still dark, streetlights casting long shadows across the asphalt. Dana didn't notice the figure who had been there all night, watching from a parked sedan 3 spaces down. She didn't see him slip from his vehicle as she unlocked her car door. She had no idea that while she slept, her car had been accessed, a small device planted beneath her dashboard. Only when she started the engine and her radio suddenly switched off, then on again, did she pause. A burst of static, then silence. Dana frowned, adjusted the dial and continued her morning routine. She was halfway to the precinct when her phone rang with an unknown number. Officer Rivas, she answered cautiously. A strange, electronically distorted voice responded. He will fall. You still have time to choose a side. Donna nearly swerved off the road. Who is this? The line went dead. She pulled over, hands shaking as she tried to call the number back. The automated voice informed her the number didn't exist. For the remainder of her drive, Dana checked her rearview mirror every few seconds, the uneasy feeling of being watched crawling up her spine. Across town, Officer Blake Murdoch was beginning his morning patrol in a predominantly black neighborhood that bordered the rapidly gentrifying West Side district. He rolled slowly past corner stores just opening, past bus stops where workers huddled against the morning chill. His radio crackled. Unit 237, we've got reports of gang graffiti on the south wall of Anderson Elementary. Possible gang activity. In progress. Blake grabbed his radio. Unit 237 responding. He hit the gas, pleased for the action. Gang activity meant potential arrests, and Blake needed to boost his numbers this month. What Blake didn't know was that the call had been routed through a scrambled channel operated remotely by a man sitting in a parked car 2 blocks from the school. When Blake arrived, the school's wall was indeed freshly painted, a crude gang symbol still glistening wet. No perpetrators in sight, but Blake noticed a group of black teenagers walking nearby. "Hey, you! Stop right there," he shouted, hand moving to his weapon. The teens froze, raising their hands instinctively. "We didn't do nothing, officer," one boy said, terrified. "Against the wall, all of you," Blake ordered, adrenaline pumping. What happened next would be disputed in official reports, but was captured perfectly by the hidden camera Caleb had mounted on the school's rain gutter earlier that morning. Blake's escalation, the teens' confusion, the unnecessary roughness as he handcuffed 3 minors who had simply been walking to school. And later that day, an anonymous tip with video footage would arrive at the desk of Internal Affairs. The third complaint against Blake Murdoch in as many weeks. Night fell on Frank Lewis's small house. He sat at his kitchen table, sipping tea and reading the newspaper, a habit unchanged despite the digital age. The house was quiet save for the ticking of the old clock on the wall, a wedding gift from Evelyn's parents 40 years ago. The sound of tires on gravel drew his attention. Through the window, Frank saw an unmarked police cruiser rolling slowly past his house, headlights off. It was the 3rd night in a row. Frank drew the curtains closed and checked the locks on his doors. The bruises on his face had faded to yellowish smudges, but the deeper injury to his sense of security remained raw. As he prepared for bed, a crash of breaking glass shattered the silence. Frank moved cautiously to the living room to find a brick on the floor, surrounded by the glittering remains of his front window. Attached to the brick was a note. "Your mouth got your son killed once. Don't let it happen again." Frank stared at the message, confused and shaken. His son wasn't dead. Estranged, yes, but not dead. Was this a threat? A mistake? Either way, the implication was clear. Someone knew about Caleb, and they were watching Frank. The next morning, Frank made his way to the community college where Nina Holloway was hosting a legal aid workshop. Students and community members filled a small lecture hall, many taking notes as Nina introduced a panel of law students offering free consultations. Frank waited until the formal presentation ended, before approaching her. "Ms. Holloway?" he said quietly. Nina turned, recognition dawning on her face. "Mr. Lewis? Frank Lewis? You know who I am?" "Of course," she said, lowering her voice. "I heard about what happened on your bus route. That officer, Murdoch. He works directly under my father." Frank nodded slowly. "That's why I'm here. I need legal advice, but the precinct made it clear filing a complaint would only bring more trouble." Nina's expression hardened. "They threatened you." "Not directly," Frank said, showing her the note that had come through his window. Nina studied it, her hands trembling slightly. "This mentions your son. My boy Caleb. We haven't spoken in years, but he's very much alive. At least he was the last I knew." "Mr. Lewis, this is serious." Nina glanced around the emptying lecture hall. "Come with me. My friend Spencer is in his final year of law school. He can help us understand your options." As they walked down the hallway, neither noticed the custodian mopping the floor nearby, his cap pulled low over his eyes, his movements allowing him to stay within earshot. Miles away, in an abandoned subway maintenance tunnel beneath the city, a meeting was taking place in the shadows. A man known only as Ghost, silver-haired, expensive watch, scarred hands, held another man by the throat against a graffiti-covered wall. "I know he's back," Ghost hissed. "Caleb Lewis is operating in my territory." "I don't know what you're talking about," gasped the terrified informant, a former Army Ranger who had served with Caleb. Ghost tightened his grip. 8 years we ran ops together. 8 years I covered his tracks, protected his identity. He doesn't get to bring his personal vendetta into my city." "Lewis is a ghost himself," the informant choked out. "If he doesn't want to be found, you won't find him." Ghost released his grip, allowing the man to slide down the wall, gasping for air. "Everyone can be found. Everyone has a weakness." He straightened his tailored suit jacket, and has just had a brick thrown through his window. In the offices of the Independent Voice, a small but respected news outlet, Melanie Parker sat surrounded by stacks of documents. Her computer screen displayed property records, city contracts, and police incident reports. A digital trail connecting Captain Jerry Holloway to a private security firm called Vanguard Shield. Her phone rang, a secure line few people had access to. "I found something," she said without preamble. "Vanguard Shield isn't just providing equipment and training to the police department. They're running surveillance on citizens, building profiles on community organizers, and they have overseas operations, military contracts." On the other end of the line, Caleb's voice was measured. "How deep does it go?" "Deep enough that when I filed a records request about their city contracts, I got a visit from Homeland Security, warning me about national security implications." "They're watching you now." "Probably." Melanie closed her laptop. "Caleb, this is bigger than what happened to your father." "I know. But my father is where it starts." Later that evening, in a disadvantaged neighborhood on the city's south side, 15-year-old Jamal Washington walked home from basketball practice, headphones on, hoodie up against the cool night air. The flashing lights of a police cruiser reflected in a store window ahead of him. Jamal instinctively tensed. Officer Blake Murdoch stepped out, hand already on his weapon. "Take those headphones off, kid. Let me see some ID." "I'm just walking home, sir," Jamal said, heart racing as he removed his headphones. "ID. Now." Blake's voice carried the edge it always did in neighborhoods like this one. "I'm 15. I don't have..." Blake grabbed Jamal's arm, spinning him around. "Hands against the wall. Now." "What did I do?" Jamal's voice cracked with fear. "Matching the description of a suspect," Blake said, though no calls had come through about any suspects in the area. As Blake began an aggressive pat-down, the cruiser's dashboard camera suddenly went dark, its indicator light blinking off. Simultaneously, Jamal's phone, tucked in his back pocket, began recording without his knowledge, activated remotely by someone parked across the street. "Listen, kid," Blake said, leaning close to Jamal's ear. "This neighborhood belongs to us now. You tell your friends, your family, anybody gives us trouble, they'll wish they hadn't. We're cleaning up the streets one way or another." The entire interaction was captured perfectly. The threats, the intimidation, the absence of any legitimate cause for the stop. And by morning, the video would be in the hands of both Melanie Parker and Internal Affairs. The following day, Donna Rivas sat in her car outside Melanie Parker's office building, gripping a flash drive like it might burn through her palm. 3 years on the force, and here she was, about to cross a line that could end her career. Or worse. She'd spent the night reviewing the audio recordings she'd secretly made. Holloway ordering the example made of Frank Lewis, Murdoch bragging about roughing up teenagers, the casual discussion of which community organizers needed to be dealt with. The voice on the phone haunted her. "You still have time to choose a side." Gathering her courage, Dana entered the building and asked for Melanie Parker. 20 minutes later, she walked out with lighter hands and a heavier heart. The decision was made. There was no going back. As darkness settled over the city that night, Frank Lewis heard a soft knock at his back door. His hand moved to the baseball bat he'd begun keeping nearby, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who's there?" he called. "It's me, Pop." The voice froze Frank in place. After a moment, he moved to the door and opened it slowly. There stood Caleb Lewis, now 38 but seeming older, his face weathered by sun and experience, his eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare Frank recognized from his own war. For a moment, neither spoke. the weight of years and unspoken words hanging between them. "You gonna invite me in?" Caleb finally asked, his voice softer than Frank remembered. Frank stepped back, allowing his son to enter. They moved to the kitchen, the same space where they'd had their last explosive argument 4 years earlier. Frank put on the kettle, an old habit when nervous. "You saw what happened," Frank said. It wasn't a question. Caleb nodded. "I should have been here. You had your reasons for staying away. Bad reasons." Caleb looked around the kitchen, noting the changes and similarities. "You still got Mom's teapot. Some things you don't replace." The kettle whistled. Frank busied himself preparing tea, using the familiar ritual to collect his thoughts. "Why did you disappear, son?" he finally asked, setting a steaming mug before Caleb. 4 years, not even a phone call." Caleb stared into the mug. "Because the war never ended for me, Pop. I came back, but I never really left it behind. The things I did over there." He shook his head. "I couldn't bring that darkness into your home. So instead, you brought nothing. I thought it was better that way." Frank's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his own mug. "And now? What changed?" Caleb's eyes hardened. "They put their hands on you." Frank studied his son's face, recognizing the dangerous calm he'd seen in other veterans, men standing on the edge of violence, held back by the thinnest thread of control. "What are you planning, Caleb?" "Justice. There are proper channels." "Like the complaint you tried to file?" Caleb cut in. "The one they threatened you for making?" Frank had no answer for that. "I'm not going to let them hurt you again," Caleb said with quiet intensity. "Or anyone else." Before Frank could respond, a sound from the front porch caught their attention. Caleb motioned for his father to stay put as he moved silently through the darkened house. Moments later, he returned with another note in his hand. "Keep your mouth shut or next time it won't be just a brick," Caleb read, his voice deadly calm. Frank watched his son's expression shift, subtle but unmistakable. The soldier emerging from behind the civilian mask. "They have no idea who they're threatening," Caleb said softly. That night, after Caleb had gone, refusing to tell Frank where he was staying, the precinct's front door received its own message, a single piece of paper nailed to the wood. "Your sins are numbered." The story broke at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. Corruption in blue, police department tied to private military contractor blazed across the Independent Voice's website. Melanie Parker's byline bold beneath the headline. The article was devastating in its precision, built on Dana Rivas's recordings, internal documents, and meticulous reporting. It revealed altered arrest reports, hidden body cam footage, and a clear data trail connecting Captain Jerry Holloway's precinct to Vanguard Shield, a private security contractor with a shadowy history of overseas military operations. By noon, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. By evening, protesters gathered outside the precinct, their signs demanding accountability, their chants echoing through downtown streets. Inside his office, Captain Holloway slammed down his phone after another call from the mayor's office. His face was flushed with rage as he addressed the officers gathered for an emergency meeting. "This is a coordinated attack on our department," he growled. "These so-called leaks are nothing but fabrications from disgruntled elements trying to undermine law and order in our city." The officers shifted uncomfortably. Many had read the article. Some had heard the leaked audio recordings of their own captain instructing them to focus enforcement efforts on neighborhoods opposing the Vanguard Shield contracts. "But sir," a younger officer ventured, "the recordings sound authentic." "Doctored," Holloway barked. "And I know exactly who's behind it." He clicked a remote, bringing up a military file photo on the wall screen, a grainy image of Caleb Lewis in uniform. "This man is a former Green Beret sniper, mentally unstable, and harboring a grudge against this department. He's targeting our officers and spreading disinformation." Dana Rivas, seated at the back of the room, kept her expression carefully neutral, even as her stomach knotted with anxiety. She'd been careful covering her tracks, but Holloway's resources were extensive. "As of now, we consider this individual armed and extremely dangerous," Holloway continued. a domestic terrorist threat to this department and this city. After the meeting, Dana drove home with constant glances in her rearview mirror. The sensation of being watched had become her constant companion. When she arrived at her apartment building, she immediately sensed something wrong. The door was slightly ajar, the lock splintered. Inside, chaos greeted her. Furniture overturned, papers scattered, laptop missing. On her bathroom mirror, written in her own lipstick, "Traitors bleed." With shaking hands, Dana packed a bag, grabbed her backup weapon from its hiding place and fled. There was only one person she could think to call, someone who might understand the danger she was in. Across town, Nina Holloway sat in her apartment, watching her father's press conference on television. Captain Holloway stood before a forest of microphones, projecting calm authority as he declared a rogue sniper was targeting his officers. "We have evidence linking this individual to anti-police extremist groups," he stated confidently. "And we will not rest until he is apprehended." Nina turned off the TV, her stomach churning. The man in the grainy photo, Caleb Lewis, was the son of the bus driver her father's officer had assaulted. The connections were becoming clearer, and the image of her father was becoming unrecognizable. Her phone rang. An unknown number. "Hello? Nina? It's Dana Rivas, Officer Rivas. I need help. Someone broke into my apartment. I think it was Blake, or someone working for your father." Nina hesitated only briefly. "Where are you now?" "Corner of Maple and 7th. "The diner. Stay there. I'm coming." On the outskirts of the industrial district, Caleb Lewis received a message on his secure phone. "Police scanner chatter, gang activity, reported at the old Westbrook factory complex. Murdoch responding personally with backup." Caleb smiled grimly. The bait had been taken. The abandoned factory had been carefully prepared over the previous 2 days. Controlled entry and exit points. Light and sound manipulated to create disorientation. Multiple vantage points established with clear sight lines. A hunter's ground, designed by a master predator. Officer Blake Murdoch arrived with 2 patrol cars as backup. Eager to redeem himself after the embarrassments of recent days, he took command immediately. "Peterson, cover the west entrance. Sanders, take the loading dock. I'll go in through the front. These gangbangers think they can use our city as their playground. Time to teach them different." The backup officers exchanged uneasy glances but followed orders. Blake drew his weapon and entered the main building alone, flashlight cutting through the dusty darkness. What happened inside was later, pieced together from Blake's own confused report and physical evidence. A series of distractions, sounds of movement, glimpses of shadows, led him deeper into the building, separating him from his backup. His radio failed at a crucial moment. Emergency lights activated suddenly, then cut out, leaving him in total darkness. And then the shot, a single, precise round that struck Blake's service weapon, shattering it in his hand without breaking his skin. Panicked, Blake fired wildly with his backup weapon, emptying the magazine into the darkness. Outside, civilians walking past the factory scattered as bullets pierced the thin metal walls and shattered windows. The officer's wild firing caught perfectly on camera by coincidental news vans that happened to be in the area. By the time backup reached him, Blake was huddled in a corner, weapon empty, hands bleeding from the shards of his destroyed service pistol. From a rooftop 3 buildings away, Caleb packed his rifle methodically. The message had been delivered. "I can hit whatever I want, whenever I want, and I chose not to hurt you this time." Captain Holloway's panic manifested as rage. In his office, he slammed his fist into the wall repeatedly while speaking on a secure line. "I don't care about protocols. I want the full Vanguard team activated now. This is exactly the situation we prepared for." Within hours, black SUVs with tinted windows and no license plates began appearing throughout the city. Men in tactical gear but no police insignia established checkpoints in key neighborhoods. Drone surveillance increased, hovering over public gatherings and protests. The city began to feel like an occupied territory. That evening, Melanie Parker sat in the back office of Channel 8 News with her old college friend, Sarah Wilson, Now, a producer for the evening broadcast. I need 10 minutes of airtime, Melanie said. Unedited live, Sarah shook her head. You know I can't do that, especially not with the pressure we're getting from the mayor's office to tone down coverage of the protests. What if I had footage that proves Officer Murdoch fired indiscriminately into a public street? What if I had evidence that Captain Holloway is using a private military contractor to suppress citizens' rights? Sarah's expression changed. How solid is it? Bulletproof. 5 minutes. That's all I can give you. And if anyone asks, I'll say you blackmailed me. Melanie smiled. Just like college. The segment aired at 6:35 p.m. just after the weather report. No introduction. No warning. Just raw footage of Blake Murdoch's panicked shooting spree, followed by Holloway's recorded voice ordering officers to make examples of community leaders opposing the Vanguard Shield contract. The station cut the feed after exactly 3 minutes, but it was too late. The story had broken through the carefully constructed narrative. Social media exploded. Protest numbers doubled overnight. In Captain Holloway's elegant suburban home, Nina confronted her father. She found him in his study, phone pressed to his ear, issuing orders in a clipped military tone. I don't care how you do it. Find Rivas and shut her up. He looked up to see his daughter standing in the doorway and quickly ended the call. Nina, you shouldn't be here right now. Is it true? She asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Did you order Officer Murdoch to make an example of Frank Lewis? You're listening to lies and propaganda. I have ears, Dad. I heard the recording. Your voice. Holloway's expression hardened. You don't understand the pressures of maintaining order. Sometimes examples need to be made. Of innocent people. Of elderly bus drivers protecting women and children. There are no innocent people in this equation, Nina. Just those who understand the world is changing, and those who need to be shown the new reality. Nina took a step back, staring at her father as if seeing him for the first time. What happened to you? What happened to protect and serve? Grow up, Nina. That's a slogan for recruitment posters. Real power comes from control, and control requires force. He moved closer. The department is evolving. Vanguard Shield is the future. We're creating a new model of security that will spread across the country. It's not security, Nina whispered. It's occupation. Holloway laughed softly. Such dramatic language. You're still so young. What Captain Holloway didn't realize was that Nina's phone was in her pocket, recording every word of his admission. By morning, the audio would be in Melanie Parker's hands. In Frank's neighborhood, tragedy struck. Unexpectedly, Rico, the young mechanic, was walking home from a late shift when a van with tinted windows pulled alongside him. Men in plain clothes forced him inside. Hours later, he was found in an alley, badly beaten, with a warning. Stay away from Frank. Lewis and his journalist friends. Frank sat beside Rico's hospital bed, rage and guilt warring within him. The boy's face was swollen beyond recognition, his right arm in a cast. This is my fault, Frank whispered. They're hurting everyone around. Me. Rico's eyes fluttered open. Mr. Lewis, he croaked. They asked about Melanie, about the videos I helped her hide. I didn't tell them anything. Frank squeezed the boy's good hand gently. You've been braver than anyone should have to be. By the time Frank left the hospital, his decision was made. He contacted Nina, who arranged an impromptu press conference on the steps of City Hall. With Melanie and Nina flanking him, Frank Lewis faced a crowd of reporters, cameras, and citizens. His voice, though quiet, carried across the hushed gathering. My name is Frank Lewis. I'm a bus driver for this city, a veteran, a father. For 30 years, I've served this community in my own small way. He touched his still healing lip. Last week, I was assaulted by police while doing my job, protecting a young mother and child from harassment. Frank looked directly into the cameras. They thought I would stay silent. They thought an old black man wouldn't fight back. They were wrong. He squared his shoulders, standing taller than he had in years. My son is not a terrorist, but I promise you, If you keep hurting people, he won't be the only one coming for you. This city belongs to its people, not to private armies or corrupt officers. As Frank spoke, Caleb watched from the crowd, his father's courage filling him with a pride he hadn't felt in years, and a determination to end the threat hanging over him once and for all. The city woke the morning after Frank's press conference to an uneasy stillness. News vans lined City Hall, reporters speaking urgently into cameras while behind them, growing crowds carried hastily made signs with slogans like "Justice for Frank" and "No Private Police." Mayor Harrison appeared briefly on the steps, reading a carefully worded statement. "We take all allegations of misconduct seriously and have initiated a review of recent incidents. In the meantime, we urge citizens to remain calm and respect the rule of law." The statement satisfied no one. Its deliberate vagueness only fueled the tension spreading through neighborhoods across the city. Frank sat in his living room, television on but muted, watching the response to his words. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. Journalists, community activists, even old army buddies who'd seen him on the news. He answered none of them. A knock at the door startled him. Frank moved cautiously to the window, peering through the curtain. Nina Holloway stood on his porch, alone. He opened the door. "You shouldn't be here. They're watching me." "I know," Nina said, stepping inside. "They're watching me too. My own father has someone following me." She looked around the modest living room. "Is Caleb here?" Frank shook his head. "He comes and goes like a ghost." "Well, we need him. Dana's gone completely underground after her apartment was ransacked. She's terrified." "What exactly did your father say to you?" Nina's eyes hardened. "Enough to know he doesn't see this as law enforcement anymore. He talked about control and force, about Vanguard shield spreading across the country." She lowered her voice. "Dad mentioned something called Phase 2. Whatever that is, it's starting now." As if on cue, Frank's police scanner, a relic from his days as a neighborhood watch coordinator, crackled with increased activity. Reports of strategic assets being deployed to key locations, code words and clipped responses suggesting a coordinated operation unfolding across the city. By midday, the evidence was visible to everyone. Black SUVs with heavily armed personnel in tactical gear, but no identifying insignia established checkpoints at major intersections. Surveillance drones buzzed overhead, no longer disguised as routine traffic monitoring. The occupation Nina had described was beginning in broad daylight. Across town, in an abandoned mechanic's garage, Caleb Lewis stood before a wall covered with maps, photographs, and tactical assessments. Each Vanguard shield location was marked, each known operative identified, their patterns documented with a sniper's attention to detail. In Caleb's methodical mind, they weren't people anymore. They were targets. His secure phone vibrated with a message from Reese, his former tech specialist from the Green Berets who'd been helping him remotely. Intercepted communication. VS plans to designate South District Youth Center as insurgent headquarters at 1500 hours. Raid imminent. The South District Youth Center, where Nina volunteered, where Rico taught kids basic auto mechanics. A community hub that had been vocal against increased policing. Caleb's jaw tightened. This wasn't random escalation. This was calculated provocation, designed to trigger community response that would justify further crackdowns. 3 miles away, Officer Blake Murdoch knelt, in the shadows behind the youth center, placing a backpack containing illegal weapons and radical literature inside a ventilation duct. His hands shook with nervous energy, his eyes darting anxiously. Ever since the warehouse incident, Blake had become increasingly erratic, convinced that Caleb Lewis was watching his every move. He wasn't entirely wrong. From a building across the street, Caleb observed through a high-powered scope, documenting Blake's actions. He could have taken the shot, ended Blake's threat permanently. But Frank's words echoed in his mind. If you become like them, you lose. Instead, Caleb photographed the evidence and sent it to Melanie with one message. Raid coming. Get the kids out. Melanie Parker's day had begun with a series of threatening phone calls and emails. Her editor had been pressured to put her on indefinite leave. Her apartment building had received an anonymous bomb threat, forcing evacuation. She was working from her car when Caleb's message arrived, with barely 15 minutes before the planned raid. Melanie called every contact she had at the youth center. Then she attempted something risky. She called the police precinct directly, asked for Dana Rivas, and left a message about Officer Murdoch planting evidence at the South District Youth Center. A dangerous move, but one that might create confusion within the department itself. Melanie's warning reached the youth center just in time. When Vanguard teams surrounded the building, they found it empty of children and staff. What they didn't expect was the live streaming equipment that had been left running, broadcasting their forced entry and fruitless search to thousands of viewers online. The raid backfired spectacularly, further inflaming public opinion. But Vanguard Shield responded not by retreating, but by escalating. Captain Holloway, now openly working alongside private security personnel, announced new, temporary security measures: a curfew in certain neighborhoods, restriction of public gatherings, and expanded checkpoints throughout the city. As darkness fell, Melanie made her way to meet a source who claimed to have internal Vanguard Shield documents. The meeting location was a parking garage downtown. Exposed, risky, but Melanie had exhausted her safer options. She waited nervously on the third level, scanning for any sign of her contact. The sound of boots on concrete came from the wrong direction. Too many footsteps. A trap. 3 men in plain clothes but military posture emerged from behind parked cars, moving with practiced coordination to surround her. Melanie backed against her car, hand moving to the pepper spray in her pocket. "Melanie Parker," one man said flatly. "You're coming with us." "I don't think so," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The leader took another step forward, and suddenly dropped to the ground, clutching his knee. No gunshot had sounded, but blood spread beneath his fingers. The other 2 men spun, drawing weapons only to find themselves similarly incapacitated within seconds. Silent, precise shots to non-lethal areas. A figure emerged from the shadows behind a concrete pillar. Caleb moved with economic grace, disarming the wounded men with practiced efficiency. "You came," Melanie said, her composure finally breaking. "You were stupid to come here alone," Caleb replied, securing the attackers with zip ties. "I didn't have a choice." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time since his return. "There's always a choice, Mel. That's what makes us different from them." Back at Frank's home, father and son faced off in the kitchen. Their reunion had been brief and emotionally guarded, but now tensions boiled over. "You're escalating a war," Frank said, his voice tight with concern. "These people have resources, connections. This isn't some foreign battlefield where you can disappear afterward. You think I don't know that?" Caleb paced the worn linoleum floor. "I've studied every aspect of Vanguard's operation. This isn't just about what happened to you anymore, Pop. They're implementing a prototype for domestic control. If it works, here, it spreads. And you think you can stop it alone, with a rifle and tactical gear? That's not justice, son. That's revenge." Caleb slammed his fist on the counter. "Then what's your solution? Trust the system that threw you to the ground? File more complaints? Wait for politicians to find their spines?" Frank stood his ground. "We build something they can't tear down. Community, witnesses, truth. If you become like them, you lose." "If I become like them," Caleb said quietly, dangerously, "they'll never see me coming." Father and son stared at each other across a gulf wider than the kitchen table between them, a fundamental difference in how they saw the world and their place in it. Their standoff was interrupted by a knock at the door. Caleb immediately moved to a defensive position, hand reaching for his concealed weapon. Frank waved him down and approached cautiously. Outside stood a tall man with graying temples and the bearing of someone comfortable with authority. "Mr. Lewis, my name is Reese Blackwood. I'm an old friend of your son's." Frank glanced back at Caleb, who nodded once in confirmation. Once inside, Reese set up specialized equipment designed to detect and block surveillance. Only when he was satisfied did he speak freely. "I've been helping Caleb remotely, but things have escalated. Vanguard's encrypted communications suggest they're preparing for something major. Urban pacification exercises, they're calling it. Reese looked grim. I've seen this pattern before. In countries where the line between police and military disappeared overnight. Can you get into their system? Caleb asked. Full access? Reese nodded. That's why I'm here. I need proximity to their main servers, but it's a one-way ticket for me. Once I'm in, they'll know someone breached their security. I'll be burned. Frank listened to the two former soldiers discuss technical details and contingencies, feeling both proud of his son's expertise and terrified by the forces aligning against them. The world had changed around him in ways he could hardly comprehend, but the fundamentals remained the same: power, control, and those who stood against both. The next day brought a breakthrough neither side had anticipated. Officer Dana Rivas, having gathered her courage, agreed to appear on a widely followed podcast focused on police accountability. For 45 minutes, she detailed the systematic corruption within the precinct, Holloway's ties to Vanguard Shield, and the deliberate targeting of community leaders. The final straw for me, Dana said, her voice steady despite her obvious fear, was hearing Captain Holloway specifically order Officer Murdoch to make an example of Frank Lewis, a respected bus driver who was simply protecting a passenger from harassment. That's when I knew this wasn't about law enforcement anymore. It was about intimidation. Within hours, Dana Rivas became both a hero and a target. Her image spread across social media platforms, her testimony transcribed and shared thousands of times. I Rode with Frank became a trending hashtag, uniting disparate groups against what was increasingly seen as an occupying force in their city. Inside the precinct, Blake Murdoch's fragile control finally shattered during an emergency tactical meeting. As Holloway outlined plans for expanded operations, Blake erupted. They're watching us. Lewis has eyes everywhere. His voice rose to a near shout, sweat beading on his forehead. He could have killed me at the warehouse. He was playing with me. Get a hold of yourself, Holloway snapped. You're embarrassing this department. Embarrassing? Blake laughed hysterically. We're at war and you're worried about appearances? I'm taking the fight to them. All of them. He stormed toward the door. Lewis, that journalist bitch, everyone helping them. After Blake left, Holloway summoned his most trusted officers. Blake's becoming a liability, he said coldly. But he might still be useful. Keep him on a short leash. He slid a paper across the table, a list of names with Melanie Parker, Nina Holloway, and Frank Lewis at the top. These are priority targets. Surveillance only for now. We'll deal with them when the timing's right. What Holloway didn't know was that one of those trusted officers was quietly working with Rico and his network of tech-savvy teenagers. By nightfall, the list would be posted online, further exposing Holloway's tactics. That night, as the city simmered with tension, Caleb struck without warning. 3 Vanguard Shield safehouses, locations used for equipment storage and operational planning, were simultaneously disabled. Power cut, communications jammed, entrances sealed from the outside. No personnel injured, but a message left at each location. This war has rules. Break them, and I won't. The message was clear. Caleb wasn't just hunting them, he was showing restraint, for now. The Vanguard Shield offices occupied the top floor of a gleaming downtown building, its windows tinted to prevent outside observation. Inside, Captain Jerry Holloway stood before a wall of screens displaying surveillance feeds from across the city. Beside him stood the silver-haired man known only as Ghost, his expensive suit and manicured appearance contrasting with the coldness in his eyes. Your son has become quite the nuisance, Ghost said casually, as if discussing a minor inconvenience rather than a highly trained operative systematically dismantling their operation. He's not my son, Holloway replied tersely. Just a problem. To be eliminated. Ghost smiled thinly. A problem you've failed to eliminate for weeks now. We'll handle it. Caleb Lewis is just one man. One man who was trained by the best, including me. Ghost turned to face Holloway directly. I ran his most sensitive operations overseas. I know what he's capable of. Don't underestimate him simply because this is playing out on American soil. In a secure office across town, Melanie Parker worked through the night, piecing together a complex investigation that had grown beyond police misconduct into something far more insidious. Spread across her desk were documents revealing that Holloway's history with Vanguard Shield predated his police career. Military records showed both men had served in the same classified operations overseas, where allegations of war crimes had been quietly buried. This goes back 15 years, Melanie told Nina and Dana, who huddled around her desk. Holloway was part of a private contractor unit in Afghanistan under Ghost's command. There was an incident in a village called Maidan Shar. Civilians killed, evidence destroyed. The military investigated but then suddenly closed the case. No charges filed. Vanguard Shield was born right after, Dana added. Staffed with the same men from that unit. Nina stared at the documents, her face pale. My father was already police captain when I was 10. He never mentioned any of this. Vanguard provided equipment and training to police departments across the country, Melanie continued. But this city was always different. A test case for full integration, blurring the line between police and private security. My God, Dana whispered. We're the prototype. A knock at the door silenced them. They'd been careful, using burner phones, switching locations, but paranoia had become their constant companion. Dana drew her backup weapon while Nina approached the door. Cautiously, it was Rico, his arms still in a cast but his eyes bright with urgency. They're moving on Frank's house, right now. Across town, Frank Lewis sat on his front porch despite the late hour and the unofficial curfew in his neighborhood. His decision to speak publicly had liberated something in him, a burden carried since youth. In the quiet darkness, he allowed himself to remember what he'd buried for decades. In 1979, Frank had witnessed 2 officers beating a handcuffed teenager behind a convenience store. He'd testified truthfully, breaking the blue wall of silence. The repercussions had been swift. Dead animals on his doorstep, brake lines cut, midnight phone calls threatening his wife and infant son. The officers were eventually convicted, but Frank had been forced to leave his job at the city's transit authority and move to another state. For 40 years, he'd carried the lesson. Speaking truth to power came with consequences that touched not just you, but everyone you loved. It was why he'd kept his head down for so long, why he'd prioritized survival over justice. But age had given him perspective. His silence hadn't protected Caleb from the horrors of war or the psychological wounds he'd brought home. It hadn't saved his community from the slow creep of militarized policing. Perhaps, Frank thought, silence had cost him more than speaking ever could. His phone rang, interrupting his reflections. Dad, get out of the house now, Caleb's voice urged without preamble. Blake's coming for you. Frank moved with surprising quickness for his age, grabbing the pre-packed bag he'd prepared for this eventuality. He was halfway down his back steps when headlights swept across the front of his house, followed by the sound of a car door slamming. Officer Blake Murdoch approached Frank's front door, weapon drawn, movements jerky with barely controlled rage. When no one answered his aggressive knocking, he kicked in the door and rushed inside. Frank had already disappeared into the darkness between houses, moving as silently as his Vietnam training allowed. When Blake emerged cursing from the empty house, Frank was long gone. Across the city, Reese Blackwood worked feverishly in the back room of an abandoned building, surrounded by specialized equipment. His fingers flew across keyboards as he attempted to penetrate Vanguard Shield's secure communications network. The task required physical proximity to their servers, which is why he'd positioned himself in the building directly adjacent to Vanguard's downtown headquarters. Almost there, he murmured into his encrypted radio. Their security is impressive, but they've got a weakness in their... The sound of the door crashing open interrupted him. Masked men in tactical gear rushed into the room, weapons trained. On Reese's head. Well, that was faster than I expected, Reese said calmly, raising his hands. The leader stepped forward, removing his mask to reveal Ghost's cold smile. Reese Blackwood, still the best technical mind in special operations, working for the wrong side now, I see. I'd say I'm on the right side for the first time, Reese replied. Ghost nodded to one of his men. Secure him. And the equipment. He leaned closer to Reese. You're going to help us send a message to your friend Caleb. Hours later, Caleb received a video file on his secure phone. The footage showed Reese, bloodied but defiant, tied to a chair. Ghost's voice came from off-camera. Tell him. Don't. Do it, Caleb, Reese said, his voice strained. Whatever they want, it's a trap. A hand entered the frame, pressing a gun to Reese's temple. Ghost spoke again. Bring Frank Lewis to the old Harborside warehouse at midnight. Just you and the old man. Or we start sending your friend back in pieces. The video ended with a gunshot and Reese's scream of pain. Caleb's expression remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened around the phone. Reese had known the risks. They both had. But knowing didn't make it easier to watch a friend suffer. He called Melanie. They've got Reese. They want me to bring my father to them. It's a trap, Melanie said immediately. Of course it is. So what's the plan? Caleb was silent for a moment. I need your help, and Nina's, and anyone else you trust. It's time to end this. Across town, Officer Dana Rivas was leaving a town hall meeting where she'd spoken publicly about police reform. The crowd had been supportive, even calling her a hero. For the first time in weeks, Dana felt the weight of fear lifting slightly. Perhaps change was possible after all. She was halfway to her car when the shot came. A silenced weapon. A skilled shooter. The bullet entered her shoulder, spinning her around with its impact. Dana collapsed to the pavement as screams erupted around her. Through the haze of shock and pain, she saw a figure in a hoodie walking calmly away, disappearing into the night. Within minutes, ambulances arrived. As paramedics worked to stabilize her, Dana fought to remain conscious. Blake, she managed to say to the officer who'd responded to the scene. It was Blake. At the hospital, Frank Lewis arrived before any other visitors. He sat beside Dana's bed, watching the machines monitor her vitals, seeing in her the courage he'd once abandoned in himself. When she briefly regained consciousness, Frank leaned closer. You were braver than most soldiers I've known, he told her quietly. Rest now. We'll finish what you started. Later that night, Rico sat in his bedroom, his injured arm throbbing as he worked his keyboard one-handed. Despite his injuries, he'd become the nexus of a digital resistance network, coordinating information from dozens of sources across the city. The police wanted to believe they were facing one man, Caleb Lewis, but the reality was more complex. Citizens of all ages were rising up, using whatever skills they had to oppose the occupation of their city. Rico had just hacked into Officer Blake Murdoch's cloud storage, a surprisingly easy task given the man's poor security practices. What? He found confirmed their suspicions. The hit list from Captain Holloway, complete with surveillance photos, addresses, and detailed plans for neutralizing targets. Frank Lewis's name was highlighted at the top with a handwritten note. Priority 1, tonight. With shaking hands, Rico uploaded the documents to a secure server, then posted them publicly with a simple message. This is who's hunting us. This is who we're fighting. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Citizens gathered outside the precinct, their numbers swelling by the hour, united in their demand for accountability. Holloway's private army couldn't arrest or intimidate an entire city. On a secure channel known only to a few, Caleb Lewis broadcast a coded message that echoed through police scanners, emergency radios, and even some commercial stations. This is your final chance to surrender your corruption. If you don't, justice will come before sunrise. In the darkness of an abandoned church, Frank prayed for the first time in years, not for safety or protection, but for wisdom, for the strength to stand rather than run, for his son to find his way back from the darkness of war without losing himself to vengeance. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you when you came home, Frank whispered into the empty sanctuary. I was afraid of your anger because I recognized it, because I buried mine. For so long, he didn't hear Caleb enter, didn't know his son had heard every word until Caleb replied from the shadows. You did what you thought was right. You always have. Frank turned to find Caleb standing in the aisle, not in tactical gear but in simple, civilian clothes, looking more like the son he remembered than the warrior he'd become. "They have Reese," Caleb said. "They want me to bring you to them." "And are you?" Frank asked, his voice steady. "No, we're bringing the fight to them. But I need to know you're with me." Frank stood, his decision made. Not just me, all of us. As dawn approached, Caleb made final preparations for the confrontation ahead. He knew Ghost's tactics, his weaknesses, knew that Holloway was a bureaucrat playing at being a warlord, knew that Blake was unraveling, becoming unpredictable. What he couldn't predict was how the city itself had changed in response to their struggle. People who had been silent were finding their voices. Communities that had been divided were standing together. The very surveillance apparatus built to control them was being turned against their oppressors. In a way, Frank had been right all along. The greatest power wasn't in weapons or tactics, but in truth, in standing still when others ran, in the courage to face the light rather than hide in shadows. As the first hints of sunrise colored the eastern sky, Caleb sent one final message to his father. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know I'm proud to be your son." City Hall had never seen a crowd like this. People of all ages and backgrounds packed the chambers for the emergency council meeting, with hundreds more spilling into the hallways and onto the building's steps. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Frank Lewis approached the podium, flanked by Melanie Parker. Their unlikely alliance, an elderly bus driver and an investigative journalist, had become the face of resistance against a system unraveling before the public eye. Frank adjusted the microphone, his composure a stark contrast to the chaos outside. "I stand before you today as a citizen of this city, nothing more. I'm not an activist or politician. I've spent my life driving a bus and minding my business." His voice, though quiet, carried undeniable moral authority. "But when Officer Murdoch threw me to the ground for simply doing my job, it wasn't just my dignity he assaulted. It was the trust between police and the community they're sworn to protect." The council members shifted uncomfortably. Mayor Harrison whispered to an aide as Frank continued. "Captain Holloway has allowed his precinct to become an extension of Vanguard Shield, a private military contractor with a documented history of human rights abuses. I'm formally requesting his immediate suspension pending investigation." A councilwoman raised her hand. "Mr. Lewis, while we sympathize with your experience, we need more than allegations to take such drastic action against a decorated police captain." Before Frank could respond, the chanting began outside. First as a whisper, then growing in strength until it penetrated the chamber walls. "Caleb! Caleb! Caleb!" The council members exchanged alarmed glances. The people weren't just demanding justice. They were invoking the name of the man Holloway had branded a terrorist, claiming him instead as their defender. Nina Holloway stood up from her seat in the audience. "Perhaps this will help the council decide." She held up her phone, connecting it to the chamber's audio system. Her father's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "The department is evolving. Vanguard Shield is the future. We're creating a new model of security that will spread across the country." Then, more damning, "Sometimes examples need to be made." The audience erupted. Council members huddled in urgent conversation. The mayor motioned for calm, his political instincts recognizing the moment when control was slipping away. "In light of this new evidence," he announced, "I am ordering the immediate suspension of Captain Gerald Holloway pending a full investigation by an independent commission." Outside, the crowd roared its approval, the sound washing over the city like a wave. Captain Holloway received the news in his command center at Vanguard headquarters. His face remained impassive, but the vein pulsing at his temple betrayed his fury. "They think this changes anything?" he said to the room of operators. "By the time their investigation begins, we'll have implemented Phase 2. He turned to his communication officer. "Deploy all units, full tactical protocol. I want every strategic point secured by midnight." Ghost watched from the corner, his expression unreadable. "You're crossing a line, Jerry. Military-style occupation of American streets won't go unnoticed by federal authorities. By the time they mobilize, it'll be too late. We'll have established control." Holloway's eyes gleamed with the zealotry. of a man who believed history would vindicate him. This city is just the beginning. As darkness fell, black SUVs and armored personnel carriers emerged from Vanguard shield facilities across the city. Men in full tactical gear established checkpoints at key intersections, their weapons and bearing unmistakably military rather than law enforcement. Drones buzzed overhead, monitoring crowd movements and identifying persons of interest through facial recognition. But the city wasn't caught unprepared. Rico's network had been tracking Vanguard vehicle movements for days. As the private forces deployed, they found neighborhoods already mobilized, not with weapons but with cameras, live streams, and coordinated civil disobedience. Every heavy-handed action was documented and broadcast in real time, and in the shadows. Between buildings, moving like a ghost among the chaos, Caleb Lewis hunted. He'd studied Vanguard's tactics in detail, identifying their command structure, communication protocols, and operational weaknesses. Where they expected armed resistance, they found carefully orchestrated confusion instead. Smoke deployed at strategic moments, communication jammers activated precisely when needed, supply chains disrupted. This wasn't a battle of firepower, but of insight and precision. Caleb neutralized squad after squad not with bullets, but with calculated disruption. Water main breaks isolating units, power outages disabling equipment, even tree branches strategically placed to block vehicle routes. By midnight, Vanguard's occupation was in disarray. Units lost contact with Central Command, equipment failed. Tactical teams found themselves surrounded not by armed insurgents, but by ordinary citizens with phone cameras, broadcasting their every move. At Frank Lewis's home, a different drama unfolded. The house stood dark and seemingly empty when Officer Blake Murdoch approached, weapon drawn, moving with the jerky intensity of a man at his breaking point. Holloway's suspension and the public's turning tide had pushed Blake beyond reason. If he couldn't follow orders anymore, he would follow his own vengeful instincts. He kicked in the door, sweeping his weapon through the darkened living room. "Lewis!" he shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "I know you're here!" A voice responded from the kitchen. "I'm right here, son." Blake spun to find Frank Lewis sitting calmly at his kitchen table, hands folded before him. On the table lay an old service revolver, within Frank's reach but not in his hand. "You're alone?" Blake asked, suspicious. "Just me," Frank replied. "Expecting someone else?" Blake advanced, weapon trained on Frank's chest. "You ruined everything. You and your terrorist son." "My son's not the terrorist here," Frank said evenly. "He's just a soldier who recognized an enemy on home soil." "Shut up." Blake's hand trembled on his gun. "Holloway was right about people like you. You don't understand what it takes to keep order. Is that what you were doing when you threw me to the ground? Keeping order?" Blake's face contorted. "You resisted arrest." "No," Frank said quietly. "I questioned your authority. That's different." Something in Frank's calm dignity pushed Blake over the edge. He lunged forward, pressing his weapon against Frank's forehead. "I could end you right now and call it self-defense. Who would question it?" "Everyone," Frank answered simply. "The whole city is watching now." A floorboard creaked behind Blake. He spun to find Caleb Lewis standing in the doorway, weapon raised. "Drop it," Caleb ordered, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man who had killed before and would do so again without hesitation. Blake froze, caught between father and son, his survival instincts warring with his rage. "Caleb." "No," Frank said, firmly, rising from his chair. "This isn't how it ends." "He would have killed you, Pop." "Maybe. But if we kill him, we prove Holloway right. We become what they fear." For an agonizing moment, the three men stood frozen in a deadly triangle. Then Frank did something neither expected. He calmly walked between them, positioning himself between Blake's gun and his son. "It's over, Blake," Frank said. "The city knows what Holloway's done, what you've done. But you still have a choice about what happens next." Whether it was Frank's words or the sound of approaching sirens that decided it, Blake's resolve crumbled. His hand dropped, the weapon clattering to the floor. Minutes later, patrol officers who hadn't aligned with Holloway's faction arrived, taking a subdued Blake into custody. As he was led away, A neighbor's live stream captured the entire scene. Frank Lewis standing tall in his doorway, embodying the dignity that no uniform or weapon could confer. Across town, Melanie Parker led a media contingent straight to the precinct where Captain Holloway had barricaded himself after his units began failing. Across the city, news vans formed a perimeter as Melanie approached the building's entrance, camera crews broadcasting live. "Captain Holloway," she called out, "the mayor has ordered your suspension. FBI agents are en route to investigate Vanguard Shield's activities. Will you surrender peacefully?" Inside, Holloway watched the monitors with growing desperation. His officers were abandoning him, some leaving quietly through side exits, others openly joining the gathering crowd. "They're just journalists," Holloway growled to the few loyalists remaining. "Clear them out." "Sir," a young officer replied. "With respect, I don't think that's a lawful order." Holloway's face darkened. "Then you're relieved of duty." He grabbed his service weapon and back up. "I'll do it myself." But when he emerged from the building, Holloway found not just journalists, but hundreds of citizens, and his own daughter, Nina, standing beside Melanie Parker. "Dad," Nina called out, her voice breaking with emotion. "Please, it's over." Holloway's eyes darted across the crowd, searching for an escape route. He spotted a gap between news vans and made his decision. Pushing past officers trying to restrain him, he sprinted for the opening, disappearing down a side street. 2 blocks away, an unmarked car waited. Holloway yanked open the door, diving into the passenger seat. "Drive," he ordered. The driver turned slowly to face him. Caleb Lewis sat behind the wheel, his expression as impassive as a stone carving. "Hello, Captain," Caleb said. Holloway's hand moved to his weapon, but Caleb was faster, disarming him with practiced efficiency. "You're going to kill me?" Holloway asked, attempting to sound defiant despite his fear. "No," Caleb replied. He removed the magazine from Holloway's gun, then placed the weapon on the dashboard between them. "I'm going to give you a choice." Caleb turned his back to Holloway, a calculated insult suggesting the captain posed no threat. "You can take that gun and try to shoot me, or you can surrender and face justice for what you've done." For a moment, Holloway hesitated. Then pride and rage overcame reason. He lunged for the weapon, aimed at Caleb's turned back, and pulled the trigger. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. Caleb had removed the round already loaded. Before Holloway could react, Caleb spun in his seat, disarming him again with a single precise movement that left the captain gasping in pain, his wrist bent at an unnatural angle. "You had your chance for an honorable ending," Caleb said, zip-tying Holloway's hands. "Now you get what you deserve, to watch everything you built fall apart while you sit in a cell." By dawn, Vanguard Shield had collapsed across the city. There, vehicles stood abandoned at checkpoints, their headquarters swarmed with federal agents seizing documents and equipment. Captain Holloway, Officer Blake Murdoch, and several other officers faced charges ranging from corruption to civil rights violations. And somewhere in the chaos, Caleb Lewis disappeared again, leaving behind a city forever changed by his intervention, but ultimately saved by the quiet courage of his father, who had finally found his voice. As sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Frank Lewis sat alone on his porch, watching neighborhood children beginning to play on sidewalks that had been empty for weeks. A subtle but profound shift had occurred. Where fear had reigned, community had re-emerged. Frank sipped his coffee, savoring not just the warmth of the cup, but the deeper warmth of vindication. The mail carrier approached with a single envelope. No postmark, no return address, just Frank's name in familiar handwriting. Inside was a brief note. "You stood taller than I ever did. I'm proud to be your son." 6 months passed. Spring gave way to summer, and summer began yielding to fall. The city breathed easier, having expelled the cancer that had grown within its police department. A new chief implemented reforms, federal oversight ensured compliance, and community advisory boards provided guidance on rebuilding trust. At Memorial Hospital, Officer Dana Rivas walked slowly down the corridor, leaning on a cane. Her recovery had been arduous. The bullet had torn through muscle and damaged nerves, but she moved with quiet determination. "Officer Rivas," called a voice behind her. Dr. Williams hurried to catch up. Director Rivas. Still getting used to that." Dana smiled. "I'm still getting used to it myself." After leaving the force, Dana had established the Blue Line Integrity Project, a non-profit organization providing legal and emotional support to police whistleblowers. Her own experience had shown her how isolated officers felt when standing against corruption, and she was determined to change that reality. "The therapy group is waiting," Dr. Williams said. "Full house today." "Good," Dana replied. "That means the word is spreading." Across town, at a community center in the South District, Nina Holloway addressed a room of supporters, her campaign posters decorating the walls. At 23, she was the youngest candidate for city council in decades, running on a platform of transparency and police accountability. "My father's actions taught me the cost of unchecked power," she told the audience. "But this community's response taught me something more important, that ordinary citizens standing together can overcome even the most entrenched corruption." Her polling numbers looked promising. The very name that had once been associated with abuse of power was being reclaimed, transformed into a symbol of redemption and reform. On the outskirts of the city, Frank Lewis completed his final run on Route 19. Though physically recovered from his ordeal, the psychological toll had convinced him it was time for retirement. As the bus pulled into the Maple Street stop, Frank was surprised to see dozens of people waiting, not to board but to greet him. Passengers from throughout his years of service stood holding handmade signs. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis," and Route 19's finest. Some held flowers, others small gifts. Many had tears in their eyes. As Frank stepped down from the bus, they erupted in applause. Martha, the night nurse who had been on his route for years, stepped forward to hug him. "You showed us all what courage looks like," she whispered. Frank, overcome with emotion, could only nod his thanks. For a man who had spent decades trying to be invisible, the recognition was overwhelming. That same afternoon, Rico Stevens cut the ribbon on the grand opening of Stevens Youth Mechanics Academy. His arm had healed, and with grant money from community development funds, bolstered by the publicity from Melanie's reporting, he had transformed an abandoned garage into a training center for neighborhood kids. Frank attended the ceremony, proud as any father would be. Rico had spent weeks in the hospital after his beating, but emerged with his spirit unbroken and his determination strengthened. "Mr. Lewis," Rico said during his speech, "taught me that standing up for what's right isn't always safe, but it's always necessary. This academy is for kids who need to know they belong somewhere, that they have value, and that their community believes in them." In a maximum security prison upstate, Blake Murdoch sat alone in the cafeteria, isolated even among hundreds of inmates. His trial had been swift, his conviction certain given the mountain of evidence. Now he spent his days in paranoid solitude, convinced that Caleb Lewis might somehow reach him even here. A guard delivered his mail, a single envelope with no return address. Inside was a short note. "There are worse things than silence. Justice knows your name now." Blake reported the note to prison authorities, demanded protection, claimed his life was threatened. But the note contained no explicit threat, and his credibility had long since been exhausted. The former officer was left to serve his sentence tormented not by actual danger, but by the shadow of the man who had exposed him. Melanie Parker's book, Shadow of the Badge, debuted at #1 on the bestseller lists, a comprehensive account of Holloway's rise and fall, and the ordinary citizens who had brought a militarized police force to justice. The dedication page read simply, "To Frank Lewis, who reminded us that courage often comes from the most unexpected places." At a book signing event, a young reporter asked Melanie about Caleb's whereabouts. "There are rumors he's been spotted overseas, that he's helping oppressed communities in conflict zones. Is there any truth to that?" Melanie smiled enigmatically. "Caleb Lewis remains a ghost, but perhaps that's what some situations require. Someone who can move between worlds, bringing justice where law has failed." On a crisp autumn evening, Frank sat on his newly repaired porch, listening to neighborhood sounds returning to normal. Children played tag on the sidewalk. Neighbors chatted across fences. The rhythms of community life, once disrupted by fear, had re-established themselves. Frank had begun writing his memoirs at Melanie's encouragement, not as a tale of revenge but as a testament to resilience. He'd titled it, "The Man on Route 19, focusing on the lives that had intersected with his over 30 years of driving, the same streets, observing the same changing neighborhoods. As darkness fell, Frank noticed something on his welcome mat, a small package that hadn't been there earlier. Inside, he found a military medal he recognized instantly, the Bronze Star with Valor device, and a photograph of a younger Caleb in uniform. Frank turned over the photo, finding a handwritten message. "I'm always watching over you, Pop." He looked out into the darkness, wondering if his son might be there, invisible but present. Frank raised his coffee mug in a silent toast to the shadows, acknowledging the bond that remained unbroken despite years and miles. Years later, a young boy boarded a city bus named the Frank Lewis in his honor, a small tribute the transit authority had implemented upon Frank's retirement. The boy, no more than 10, stared at the plaque near the driver's seat with Frank's photo and a brief description of his service. "Who was Frank Lewis?" the boy asked the driver. The driver, a middle-aged man who had once been a teenager live-streaming police abuse from a street corner, smiled warmly. "Frank Lewis," he replied, "was the bravest man I ever knew, because he stood still when everyone else ran." The bus pulled away from the curb, continuing the route Frank had driven for decades. Above the city, like a guardian spirit, the legend of Caleb Lewis lived on in whispered stories, the shadow defender who had appeared when needed most, and then vanished back into the world's forgotten places. And in a small house on a quiet street, Frank Lewis's memoir sat proudly on bookshelves in homes throughout the city, a reminder that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are those who simply drive us safely home. What price are we willing to pay for justice when the system itself becomes corrupt? Frank and Caleb's journey reminds us that courage comes in many forms, sometimes in standing still when others run. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share to support more powerful narratives about ordinary heroes facing extraordinary challenges.